Good evening. Good evening. I'm Will Hurst, and I'd like to welcome you to the Hearst Tower. This site has been the headquarters of the company that was founded by my grandfather 136 years ago. And this building is relatively new. We were planning, the original building was built in 1927, and it was designed by a set designer named Joseph Urban, after whom this theater is named. And my grandfather, having liked architecture and built some exotic buildings out there in California, like San Simeon, he thought a set designer would, set the right tone. Anyway, so the building was built, and the thought was that there'd be a tower kind of arising from this outer sort of older building that you can see when you're on the street. But the Depression came after 1927, and so the company ran out of money and decided to just live inside this sort of base fulcrum building. And then around the year 2000, the company decided that they really needed to have a bigger, better headquarters. And they were planning to build this building, and they had an architectural competition. And the building was going to be designed by Norman Foster, who's a Pritzker Prize winning architect. And they were all set to go. And then 9/11 happened, and the whole city of San Francisco sort of froze. And people were very afraid that people wouldn't want to move to Manhattan. So we were one of the first people to apply for a building permit after. It's always better to be lucky than smart. So our timing was great because the city was really looking to get anybody to build anything. The outer part of the building was considered landmark, so we had to kind of core out the old building. So all that's left is just that shell that you saw when you came into sort of the central courtyard there, and then the tower rises above that. And this was the first platinum LEED building in Manhattan, which at the time the Hearst Company probably didn't think that would matter that much, but it's been very good for employees, and people like being in this building, and they know that it's a green building and it recycles everything. I'm very pleased to welcome you here. I'm a fan of the process of translation. I'm certainly not an expert. I had the same sort of dumb view of things that none of you have, because you're all in and around this business. But when I was a student, I was a classmate of Ben Fitzgerald, whose father, Robert Fitzgerald, had translated the Odyssey into English verse. And I went to visit my friend Ben in Umbria, where the family had a summer place. And I remember Robert Fitzgerald was at that time translating the Iliad into English verse. And he had this long, like a drafting table, sort of almost the length of this wall. And above, on the upper layer, was sort of the ancient Greek text of the Iliad. And then there were all these sort of efforts. He was trying to find the right word, and should it rhyme, and get the meter right. And it really left me with a lasting impression that I had no real understanding of how complex and interesting translation really was, that he was really building a bridge from an author who'd written hundreds of years ago to a modern audience. And he was trying to find ways to capture the spirit, the cadence, the sound, the poetry of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and render them in English verse, which was a very hard thing to do. But I came away with enormous respect for people that do translation. So I'm very pleased to welcome you here. I'm an enthusiast for what you do. And thank you. I'll turn it over to the program now.
All right, bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you especially to Mr. Hurst for graciously hosting us in this beautiful building. We're very lucky to celebrate in such a special, lovely space. My name is Elizabeth. I'm the program director for this program at the French American Foundation, and I have the pleasure of running the prize. It's a very special program. It's near to many of our hearts. But before we begin, I want to acknowledge by name the wonderful work of our finalists and their excellent translations. So if you would please hold your applause. In fiction, we have Allison Anderson, Charlie Verstrite, and Jeffrey Landon Allen for their co-translation, Teresa Lavender Fagan, Gila Walker, who's here tonight, and in nonfiction, Christine Piccini, Allison Strayer, David Wills, and Catherine Porter. Congratulations. And of course, we're here to honor the exceptional translations of our winners, Juliette Sutcliffe in fiction for her translation of The Music Game by Stephanie Clermont, and Kieran Ahrens and Cédrine Michel, who unfortunately could not be with us tonight, but in nonfiction for their co-translation of Self-Defense, A Philosophy of Violence by Elsa Dora. A round of applause for our winners, please. for the presentation of the awards, we have the pleasure of tuning into a special keynote segment, and it is my honor to introduce Alice Kaplan as our distinguished keynote speaker for the evening. Dr. Kaplan is a tremendous scholar, historian, author in English and in French, and tenured translator. She's the Sterling Professor of French at Yale University, where she also helped found the Yale Translation Initiative. Her recent works, both published last year, include the novel Maison Atlas Roman, written in French, and States of Plague, reading Albert Camus in a Pandemic, written with Laura Maris. She's a former Guggenheim Fellow, a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and a recipient of the French Légion d'honneur. She has been awarded the LA Times Book Prize and the Henry Adams Prize. Please join me in welcoming Alice.
Good evening. Thank you to the foundation, to the jury, and to the laureate of the prizes. I'm really pleased to be here. So tonight we are celebrating Juliet Sutcliffe's translation of Stéphanie Clermont's The Music Game and Kieran Aaron and Cédrine Michel's co-translation of Elsa Dorland's Self-Defense, A Philosophy of Violence. Two books that brilliantly negotiate cultural difference between Francophone and Anglophone worlds. One of the great translation theorists, Antoine Berman, has said that all that matters in evaluating a translation is what's on the page. But translation is so much more. Translators are international literary agents, they're go-betweens, diplomats, and sometimes they're even therapists. I've been interested for a long time in author-translator relationships, in finding sources that might allow us better to understand them. This fall, I had the good luck to stumble upon the correspondence of a French translator with an American writer that began in the 1930s and continued for over 40 years. And it's as intimate and colorful as any lover's correspondence. Marcel Sibon met Catherine Ann Porter through Sylvia Beach at Shakespeare and Company in Paris. Sibon became one of the most celebrated and admired translators of her generation. Catherine Ann Porter and Graham Greene were her major authors. She also translated Nathaniel West, John O'Hara, Robert Louis Stevenson, and Shakespeare. She helped found a journal and an association for literary translators. She fought battles we're still fighting today for the translator's name to appear on the cover of books and for translators' contractual rights. Early in their exchanges, Marcel Sibon sends Catherine Ann Porter a sketch of her boxcar apartment on the Quai Voltaire overlooking the Louvre. A crazy layout, she explains, that only a crazy translator could tolerate. She lives alone with two parakeets. Shortly after the fall of France, the Red Cross informs Catherine Ann Porter that Marcel Sibon is dead. The house where she'd been staying in northern France in June 1940 was reduced to ashes by Nazi incendiary bombs. But Sibon had escaped and made her way with millions of refugees to the south. 4 years later, in 1944, back on the Quai Voltaire, she reaches out to Porter to say she's alive. She's cold, there's no soup, no thread, no soap, no thread or cotton, no stockings, neither tea nor coffee nor pepper, but she's eager to get back to work. By April 1945, now the beneficiary of multiple care packages from Catherine Ann Porter, Marcel Sibon has a mission. She wants her translations of Porter to change the French idea of American literature. She writes, I quote, "The French public has a sort of notion that American literature is all made up of drunks, miserable people feeding on raw turnips along inhospitable roads going west, gangsters and so on, talking the most appalling slang. Faulkner, Caldwell, Steinbeck and company are great, but no one will understand here that their language is one language, their view only one view. Fortunately, some intelligent people are awakening to the fact that there is another American literature following the more classical lines of James, for instance. And I'm sure your stories will satisfy the more refined readers. She doesn't say his name, but of course she's referring to Maurice Edgar Coindreau's translations of Steinbeck, Caldwell, and Faulkner at Gallimard. American literature is Coindreau literature, Sartre is supposed to have said in 1948. Her unpublished letter reveals Marcel Sibon's satirical talent. The novel, Stendhal wrote in The Red and the Black, is a mirror traveling on the highway. The American novel, Sibon writes to Porter, tongue-in-cheek, is a wagon train going west full of wretched drunks eating root vegetables. Marcel Sibon certainly knows that Catherine Ann Porter grew up in rough Scrabble, Texas, and appreciates the fact that Porter's career is a luxury vehicle heading east towards more and more literary refinement. Sibon did not, of course, succeed in imposing Catherine Ann Porter as the very definition of American literature in France. Porter gets so tired of hearing her translator complain about the deaf ear of French publishers that she threatens never to let her books appear in France again. But it's a short-lived quarrel. In 1962, Porter has her first great commercial success with The Ship of Fools, and Sibon shares each phase of her translation. Quote, "Darling, I've come to part 2 of our book, and the poor fools are dribbling out of the ship. And believe me, if you can, I'm going to miss them when I've finished." So they grow old together, and in old age, they're still corresponding, reporting on their health, the death of friends, and remembering nostalgically their work together. They die only months apart in 1980. It's worth considering the fact that Coindreau has become a metonym for American literature, while Sibon's work has faded. They were both enormously productive with institutional clout, literary talent, and personal charm. But Sibon was a woman, and she was translating a woman in a macho literary world. The odds were against her. Yet her letters remain. Writing in English, in perfect English, in unguarded and spirited prose, Marcel Sibon has left a treasure waiting to be excavated, the story of her life as a translator. Something makes me think that she'll have the last word. Thank you.
I have the pleasure of moderating a short Q&A with Alice. 40 years of communication between the two of them. Between a French translator and an American writer in the 30s, how did you discover this correspondence?
It's really unusual in the archives to find a two-way correspondence between any writer and another person. So half of it's at Library of Congress, half of it's at University of Maryland. And I found it by a fluke. I'm working on an Algerian writer who was brought to Paris by a European woman in 1947. This European woman left all her papers to the colonial archives in Aix-en-Provence. And among the people who wrote to her a lot about Baya, the painter, was this woman, Marcel Sibon, who was her high school teacher. And I thought, who in the world is Marcel Sibon? Because the letters were so good.
It's hard to believe that it hasn't been yet unturned by you, which is why I ask.
Well, I had no idea that Marcel Sibon was connected to Catherine Ann Porter until I looked her up in WorldCat and saw she'd, published everything Catherine Ann Porter ever wrote. And so then you can go on something called Archive Grid now and find out where papers are. So it turns out all her papers are in Maryland. So off I went during the pandemic to Maryland.
Very good.
Had a good time.
And you mentioned, so your book Maison Atlas, I'm going a bit off script, was also, it took place in Algeria.
Yes.
There's a link, is it deliberate or intentional to Algerian culture and
so when
how it makes way
I've worked
into your-
quite a lot on Camus, and in 2012, for the 50th anniversary of Algerian independence, I went to Algeria for the first time. Travel to Algeria has been really tough. They had a civil war in the 1990s. It's been very hard to get visas. But since 2012, I've been back almost every year, and one project led to another. I mean,
Wow.
first there was Camus, and I was, trying to walk in his steps as he was writing The Stranger. So I wrote about that. And then I decided that I wanted to write a novel because I kept seeing traces of Jewish life in Algiers, and there's no Jewish community left. There's one family, and the son of that family, who I turned into the character Daniel Atlas in my novel, he's the representative of a Jewish community that no longer exists. So
Wow.
that was the story I wanted to write.
Wow.
And then along the way, everywhere I went, I saw paintings by Baya. She's kind of the iconic painter of independent Algeria. And so I started digging into her story. And that's how I got to Marcel Simon,
I
a
see.
long,
I see.
circuitous route.
Well, I can't wait to read your new work, especially with all of this context. That'll be exciting. Shifting gears a bit, in your speech, you said Sibon was a woman and she was translating a woman in a macho literary world. The odds were against her. I'm curious, in your eyes, to what extent has gender studies, modern feminist perspectives influenced the field of translation, the way that female authors are translated? Can you speak on that?
Sure. I mean, the first thing to say is, the post-war era when Marcel Sibon was working, it was post-war heroics. Existentialism ruled the day. She didn't think much of existentialists. She thought that they were depressing and kind of boring and not really accessible to a larger public. And they were, I mean, Sartre called the shots in the 1940s. And his idea of American literature was a very romantic idea of men on ranches. He would say, you can find all of French literature that matters in a 1-mile radius around Saint-Germain-des-Prés. But to understand American literature, you have to think of these writers who are adventurers, who go out west.
Macho to the max.
Yeah, macho to the max. So that was a lot to go up against. And certain women writers did go up against it. I mean, Nathalie Sarraute was one who had to resist that whole world. I would say that, like the novel, translation is a mirror walking down a highway. So, every kind of movement, political movement in translation mirrors what's going on in society. I don't know if any of you read the recent PEN Translation Manifesto, but it is very much written in the voice of all the other things that are going on in society right now. A cry against inequality, against not enough African American translators, not enough pay for translators. I guess there are probably quite a number of women translators and always have been. And in fact, Marcel Sibon goes on record, I think it's in Le Figaro, saying that translation is a lovely activity for women. But she played it both ways. She said it's a lovely activity for women. And at the same time, she got furious when Gallimard republished one of her Graham Greene translations in a luxury edition without mentioning her name.
I can't blame her.
She got right on it.
Good for her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, the thing about, being a lovely profession for women, I mean, that's not the way she lived her life.
No, certainly not. I mean, at one point
Yeah.
we thought she was dead.
Right.
And she came back to life.
She said, the Red Cross disposed of me awfully quickly.
Well, she had to keep working.
Yes, she
Didn't
did. She did.
Yeah. On a personal level, I'm curious about your story and your journey and what led you to, pursue a career in translation, literary arts, and
Yeah,
French language
yeah.
as well.
The paradox is I came through a very traditional, you must have perfect French, you must have no accent, you must never, never translate in your head. I mean, I had this idea that translation was the original sin. You have to learn to speak in French. You should never use a French-English dictionary, God forbid. And so when I started translating, I felt as if I were committing a sin, really. And I've completely relaxed about all those things about perfect French. I now kind of enjoy having an accent because it feels that it's my personality in French.
Good.
And I think as French has become threatened by the hegemony of English, it's just become more and more important to bring French books into English so that more people can read them.
Yeah, couldn't have said it better myself. That's what the prize is all about.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
Um, and at Yale, you are a founding member of the Yale Translation Initiative. And I'm curious, kind of in your own words, what is that initiative? What does it do? And what do you see among the next generation of translators,
Yeah.
of French students? What hope can we hang on to?
That's a lot of questions. I mean, we started out, we'd scraped the internet and found out there were something like 650 people on the faculty and staff who did translation in one way or another. And we decided to have an umbrella organization that would represent them all. And then finally, because at Yale, nothing matters unless it's in the curriculum, we devised a certificate in translation studies at both the undergraduate and the graduate level. And I'm just so impressed. I mean, there's a journal called the Journal of Literary Translation out of comparative literature that we're now in a position to help fund. The students work in so many languages and they have such sensitivity to literature that might otherwise have been hidden from view. They're translating comics, they're translating writers of color, they're translating, Creole. I mean, they really have a very broad view of the literary arts.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, I'm excited about all that they're going to be able to do. We can just see as translation is on the map more and more, the respect it has on campus. I mean, it's now, in a way, one of the theoretical centers of the way we think about reading literature.
Right.
All
Wonderful.
interpretation is translation, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
My last question, I want to focus on a work that you're currently revising, which was a
Yes.
translation that you did back in 2003, OK Joe. You told me by Louis Gilloux. You told
Mhm.
me a bit what it was about. A French translator during kind of a Jim Crow era army, and he translated for American officers. And now you're redoing the translation 20 years later. So how has your
Right.
process evolved?
It's
How
the
has it
first
changed?
time I've had the chance to correct one of my translations. It's really
Go easy on
fun
yourself.
because I read it with new eyes, really having done a whole year of work reading translation studies. And the new thing in translation studies is that you should respect the foreignness of the work a little more than you did before. So when I worked with Ryan Bloom on his translation of Camus' American Diaries, when Camus went to New York in 46, Ryan Bloom wanted to keep the mistake that Camus made on Leon and Eddie's nightclub. He sort of Frenchified the name of the nightclub. I went. So Louis Gilloux was a translator for the US Army in Brittany in the summer of 1944, and he ended up as the interpreter in courts martial. And he had this laser vision of the Jim Crow Army and racial discrepancy in sentencing. And he would imitate the voices of these American officers and their sort of idealism that was just hiding a lot of hypocrisy and racism.
Mm-hmm.
And every once in a while, I mean, he had a wonderful ear for language, but every once in a while he'd get it slightly off. Whereas before I would have corrected it to make it sound absolutely perfect, I kept the few idiosyncratic things.
Mm-hmm.
And in the original French, he has all the American words he uses in italics, so they stand out.
Oh.
And I had erased the italics. I kind of naturalized the translation. And this time around, I put back the italics.
Oh.
Even though they're not in, they're in the ambient language now, I wanted the reader to be able to see that those words had been important to you as foreign words.
Mm-hmm. It's a fascinating process, and it has so much to do with identity and how we translate what was once a past cultural artifact into something that we see in a new light, and we make it unsinful in a
It's
way.
so true. I mean, I think Gilloux really shows that being outside the culture allowed him to see aspects of our racial ideology that we wouldn't become aware of until decades later. I mean, those officers thought they were idealists, they were making the world safe for democracy, and boy,
Yeah.
they didn't get what they were doing
No one's
in that
100%
army,
right.
that segregated army.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's fascinating. I can't wait to see it as well. Alice,
Thank
thank you
you.
so much for letting us interrogate
Thank
you a
you.
little
It's
bit
a
and
pleasure
learn
to
more
be
about
here.
you.
Can't wait for the awards.
I have the pleasure of now introducing Corinne Tectyrus, who is a juror this year on the Translation Prize. She's a scholar of translation studies and world literature with research and teaching interests in post-colonial theory, globalization, gender and sexuality studies, critical race studies, and paratextual studies. So I hope you found that chat interesting as it relates to your research. She's published articles about Haitian immigrant literature, Francophone Caribbean writers, Czech literature and activist translation. Dr. Tatiris is also a literary translator herself, focusing on the work of contemporary women writers from Haiti, Africa, and the Czech Republic. She's taught a variety of courses on the theory and practice of translation, world literature, literary theory, and literature and social justice. Before coming to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, she taught at several colleges and universities across the US and spent half a dozen years teaching and researching in France and the Czech Republic. So please welcome Corinne Tectyrus.
Thank you. My reading glasses are making their public debut today. So excuse me. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Thank you to the French American Foundation for making these prizes possible. And thank you to Elizabeth McGeehee for the seamless organizing of this event tonight and the entire jury selection process. So could we have a round of applause for Elizabeth? And I'd also like to thank my fellow jury members. Unfortunately, many of them could not be here tonight, but we had a very lively discussion choosing these very deserving winners among a really fantastic field. So it is my great pleasure to first present the Fiction Translation Prize to Juliette Sutcliffe for her translation of Stéphanie Clermont's The Music Game. This award-winning French-Canadian debut work weaves loosely interconnected stories into an overarching narrative of young adults finding their way in the new millennium. The jury was impressed with the way Juliette Sutcliffe captured the voice of the music game's millennial characters in a book rich with dialogue without resorting to infantilizing cliches. The translation skillfully conveys the book's irony and gentle satire that never fully devolves into cynicism. As the characters struggle with romantic relationships and friendships, with unemployment and university studies, and with staying true to their political and activist commitments, Sutcliffe's translation gracefully follows Clermont's movements between knowing humor and deep sentiment and pathos. A prolific and accomplished translator, Juliette Sutcliffe has, with the translation of The Music Game, made a powerful new voice in Stéphanie Clermont accessible to English language readers with a book that refuses to give up on hope for a better future, personal and collective, despite the failures of the past. Please join me in congratulating Juliette Sutcliffe for the Fiction Translation Award.
Apparently I was jumping the gun a little bit to get up on the stage back then. This is my first award. When I flew into New York on Sunday, they ask you, as they do, what you've come to the country for. My daughter's laughing already. I said, I've won an award, I've come to receive it. The man said, a what? I said, an award. I'm coming to an awards ceremony. A what now? Anyway, finally, he worked out what I was saying, I worked out what he was saying, and he asked what it was for, and I said it was a translation award. And he said, did you use Google Translate? And I said, no. He said, why not? I said, well, I'm a better writer than Google Translate. My daughter at this point was like, Mom, no, they won't let us into the country. Anyway, I'm absolutely delighted to be here tonight. This is possibly the favorite of all the books I've translated. So it was actually back in 2019 that I was asked to read this book for Biblioasis and to see if I'd be interested in translating it. It didn't take me very long before I knew that I really loved the book. I was having a discussion with one of my fellow finalists before coming into the stage here. And I was saying how, for me, I love a book when it really speaks to me. It sort of, sees into my soul. And she had the exact opposite idea of what made a good book. So always good to find out that people don't think the same as you. So anyway, I'm going to read a little section from the first proper chapter that just was really sort of perfect for me, made me think, yes, this is a book. I have to translate this book, and I'm going to do a good job of it. So it's called The Employee. In a brief lull between two customers, I headed over to the cash register and pressed the feed button. I took the rectangle of white paper that spooled out of the printer and laid it on the metal work counter. Mrs. Jelina had gone off to get a nice cup of coffee, and I, the employee, was now all by myself at the stall, desperate to get a few ideas down. I unclipped the pen from my apron, stuffed a handful of ground cherries into my mouth, and bent over the scrap of paper. In tiny writing, I scrawled a list of things to do when I got home: laundry, push-ups, sit-ups, read the news, 30 minutes, research Quebec's colonial history, submit a poem to a poetry review. When I'd filled the whole paper, I folded it in half, slipped it into the back pocket of my jeans shorts, pulled out a fresh slip of register tape, and wrote a list of things I wanted to do before the end of the year. Join the Y, finish writing poetry collection, send at least 3 short stories to literary reviews, learn Spanish, save $500, unrealistic, take driving test, take first aid course, deepen connections with friends, learn to identify local plants, go camping more than once, see Jess at least 3 times. For a split second, I forgot I was at work. So one of the reasons that spoke to me so deeply as an initial introduction to the book was that my very first job that I ever had as a teenager was strawberry picking. I would pick strawberries from 6 a.m. till 10 a.m. and then move into the shop where I sold strawberries, gooseberries, raspberries. And I never remember to take paper with me, so I did that exact thing with the receipt paper. Probably made a list every day, never looked at them again once I'd left work. But the whole book just spoke to me, the characters, their preoccupations, their sort of wondering whether they're even right to continue worrying about things they've worried about or caring about things they've cared about. And then the whole idea of whether they're being left behind, whether the other people they thought also cared about the same things have now moved on and are actually, having careers, having proper jobs, giving up in one or more than one of the characters' perspectives. Anyway, we'll discuss the book a little more, I'm sure. I would like to thank the foundation and the jurors for giving me such an honor and allowing me to be here tonight. And my publisher, Biblioasis. This was the first book I've translated for them, so I'd like to thank Dan Wells and Stephen Hannigan. And obviously my wonderful children, one of whom is here tonight, Rowan. And she was very pleased to be able to come on this trip. It's actually her 16th birthday tomorrow, so no champagne tonight.
Thank you for that reading, Juliet. And I think you really hear the voice of these millennial characters in that reading. So I wondered if you could talk a little bit about your translation process, especially capturing these millennial voices. And there's a lot of dialogue in the text, and even the text that isn't dialogue feels very talky. And so I'm just wondering about that process, and if you read out loud or maybe check things with your daughter.
It's an interesting question, partly because I don't know that I have a very good answer to it. In one sense, I just translated the words that she had. I do read things out a lot. And there's always a question, I'm not Canadian, I'm not from Quebec, but I'm also not English Canadian. And so there's the question of whether I'm even going to get something right in those terms, never mind the actual voices of the specific characters and where they're from. So yes, I read a lot. My children were a bit little at the time. I've taken my daughter's advice on other translations, but for this one, I felt the French was not cliche, and so it made it easy to not be cliche in English. And I also think, I mean, maybe just me, but that sort of existential teenageness just doesn't really go away. It just gets buried under the day to day and the hard reality of just getting on with things. So,
Yeah, and you mentioned that sort of specific Canadianness, and I wonder, if you make different translation decisions when you're translating, let's say, a novel from France as opposed to a French Canadian novel, and you've grown up with British English, but you're based in Canada now, and how do you find an English for, let's say, a novel like this, which is Canadian as opposed to other work?
Yeah, that's another good question. I've only actually translated one book from France. It was a book of short stories. The author is from France and now lives in Australia, so is completely fluent. So again, it was introducing another English. I mean, his readers would be mainly in Australia. I sometimes think I'm tempted to make things a little too British and let the editors deal with it if they want to remove it. But yeah, I try to be faithful to the place the novel or the story is about and where it's from, maybe more than the intended, or not the intended audience, maybe the audience that it's in the place where it's being published, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I wondered if there were any particular translation problems with this novel that were particularly thorny for you, or took some extra time to work out.
Yes, there was an interesting issue with one of the characters, Jess, who is the partner of Sabrina, who is the person I think of as the main character. I'm not sure that she is. She may be. It's complicated. And Jess is sometimes referred to as he and sometimes referred to as she, but there's no announcement, there's no signaling that there's going to be a switch. It's just it's very naturally accepted by the book as well as the characters. But what made that tricky in moving it into English was possessive pronouns, because in French, it doesn't matter. You can't tell the gender of the person from the object that they possess. Whereas in English, you can. So that was one thing I was very careful to ask Stéphanie, especially in places where it changes quite close, a number of times in close succession. Can you just make sure that I haven't, or that I've switched in the right places? So that was definitely a challenge. But she is also completely fluent in English, so she was a big help.
Yes, did you work closely with her, and is she? Do you have plans to work on her next publication?
We didn't work closely at the beginning. We exchanged emails and so on, and then we had the chance to work quite solidly on it for a couple of days at the Montreal Salon du Livre in must have been 2019. It was sort of coming to the end of the translation process, and that was a really great opportunity. I mean, we also worked with the French editor who'd brought the book into French with the original press, and it was just a really interesting. You have a 20-minute discussion on 2 words. Maybe not everybody's cup of tea, but I'm sure a lot of people in this room would enjoy such a discussion. And as for the next novel, I'm not sure. So we'll see. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, fingers crossed for sure for us as readers. And thank you so much again. And please, another round of applause for Juliette. And I have to thank my co-juror, Yasser El Hariri, for preparing the commendation for the next prize. Unfortunately, Yasser was not able to be here. So it's again such a great pleasure to present the prize winners for this year's winning translation in the nonfiction category, Kieran Ahrens and Cédrine Michel, for their translation of Elsa Dorlin's Se défendre, une philosophie de violence, which was published to critical acclaim in 2017 by Éditions Zone, winning the Prix François Non in 2018 and the Prix de l'écrit social in 2019. Translated by Ahrens and Michel as Self-Defense, a Philosophy of Violence. The essay is a historical tour de force, taking the reader from the 17th century Code Noir to Rodney King riots in 1991, via the philosophies of John Locke and Thomas Hobbes, colonial Guadeloupe in 1803, lynching in North America, the writing of Ida B. Wells, the Jewish Combat Organization during World War II, the Black Panthers, and LGBTQ activism, among many other historical and philosophical flashpoints. So you can see how much material that Kieran and Cédrine had to manage. Self-Defense is a work of impressive erudition and so makes great demands of its translators. Kieran Ahrens and Cédrine Michel draw on their combined experience as researchers and translators to bring Dorlin's text to life in English. Unfortunately, Cédrine, as I mentioned, could not be with us tonight, but please join me in congratulating both Kieran Ahrens and her for the Nonfiction Translation Award.
Good evening. On behalf of myself and my co-translator, Cédrine, I can say that it's an honor to be here tonight with you today, We wish to thank the jury members, our editor at Verso, Jesse Kindig, as well as Elsa Dorlin for writing such a deserving work to begin with. I'd also like to shout out my friend and collaborator, Grégoire Chamaillou, who edited the initial French version of Se défendre for his series Éditions Zone, and who first introduced me to Elsa over a decade ago, actually. I'd like to dedicate this award to my high school French teacher, Mrs. Pigeon, whose first name I don't even know, and who I tortured needlessly out of boredom and aimless aggression, and who had the good sense to throw me out of her class before the school year had even come to a close. I'm sure nothing on earth would come as a greater surprise to her than to see me standing here today. I'm kidding. I'm not kidding. She literally threw me out of the class. I was not welcome. Cédrine unfortunately couldn't join us today because of trouble crossing the US-Canada border, but she wants to express that she's deeply honored to receive the award. As a recent graduate in a translation program, she says that she never could have guessed that her first book-length project would be so well received. She'd like to thank her mother, Janet, for raising her with the French language despite growing up in an Anglophone Canada. Getting your only employable skill before you're even old enough to remember is a real gift, she says. Since the goal of a good translator is ultimately, perhaps disputably, to disappear into the content translated, I'll take this occasion to say a few words about the book itself. For those who haven't read it, Dorlin's book presents a genealogy of the concept of self-defense, drawing together questions of violence, subjectivity, and the body. Its aim is to rework a series of classical philosophical questions, such as violence and nonviolence, the relationship between action and reaction, their hierarchization, mimesis, vengeance, and so on, while displacing the terms of the problem. As Dorlin observes, self-defense is a concept with a decidedly impure history. On the one hand, it's that in the name of which states, militias, and upright citizens assassinate children in the streets in the name of our democracies, the Trayvon Martin case being only the most tragic and recent example at the time of its initial publication. Yet self-defense is also that which permits movements to take back the fight, in addition to being that which enables me, you, all of us, but especially communities routinely subjected to social terror and harassment to survive everyday life. I first translated an early draft of the book's preface for Elsa in 2012, some years before the Black Lives Matter movement. In the early draft, Dorlin highlighted the case of Cece McDonald, a transgender woman of color who faced a brutal assault by racist transphobes in Minneapolis on June 5th, 2011, that left her seriously injured and one of her attackers dead. Although acting in self-defense, MacDonald was accused of second-degree murder and placed in the male wing of the prison in which she was being held. The case highlights several of the themes explored in Dorland's book. As a genealogist in the tradition of Michel Foucault, Dorland's aim is to trace the complex historical mechanics of a technology of power that works to produce defenseless bodies, i.e., bodies and subjectivities that have been separated from their power, or in which this power has been turned back against them, or alternately, bodies that have been driven to such an extreme point of self-defense, to the point of being damaged, as Adorno might say, by extreme violence, that for them no defense is possible, and consequently they become indefensible. At the same time, Dorland belongs to a tradition of feminist thought that aims to place the notion of the victim in question as a political category. This becomes evident in the critical positions she adopts toward the ethics of care and its reception and translation in Western European and American feminism. To this end, she analyzes a series of literary, poetic, and cinematic sources, also pulp fiction, advertisements, all of which serve to illustrate what she calls a phenomenology of the prey, in which Cedrine and I explore further in an article called Fighting Dirty, published on the Verso blog for those interested. There's a lot more that I could say, but I don't have the time to point out about the book. We find a new theorization of the matrix of war and conservation in modern social contract theory, riveting analyses of Black power and queer movements, anti-fascist workers' movements, and groups of insurrectional communist Jews leading a Warsaw ghetto uprising, alongside histories of martial arts, and so on. In all of this, Dorland is careful, I should add, not to romanticize violence. Drawing inspiration from Frantz Fanon and Judith Butler, self-defense remains keenly attentive to the gendered and racialized mythologies that have long accompanied such questions. What kinds of pleasure does it bring us to imagine ourselves as puissants, to identify our idea of our own power with the capacity to attack others? Since neither Dorland nor Cedrine and I subscribe to a politics of nonviolence, such questions are all the more urgent to return to continually. In the final analysis, how we think about violence says a lot about how our movements and struggles understand what it means to win. If we wish to avoid a purely phantasmatic image of victory, then reflections like these Dorland offers may prove to be essential tools for the coming struggles.
Thank you, Kieran, for that introduction to the work. And I'm sure many of you will now want to read it if you haven't already. Collaborative translation is not the norm by any means. I wondered if you could speak about the process of working with Cedrine and your process for tackling such a dense book.
Yeah, kindly, the mic is working. Yeah, great. So one of the funny things about Cedrine and I is that we've never actually met in person. And not only because Cedrine has issues coming across the border, but it so happens that as we began this, the pandemic and so on hit, and it's just never been the case that we've been in the same place at the same time. So the process was at the same time what many of us became accustomed to during the pandemic, which is to say a Google Doc for the main translation, another Google Doc for the list of terminology, another third Google Doc for research sources, and then a massive Google Drive of all of the sources that we had to compile and to track down quotes and so forth, right? So I think aside from that, the process was largely what you would imagine, each of us working and then revising the other's work. I think one of the things that distinguishes Cedrine as a translator is that she's particularly good at taking the language from what is in many ways a rich philosophical, but also erudite and dense French, and in placing it into a highly accessible English language. And I think one of the things that sort of I buffered that with was an attention to the philosophical terminology that can't be lost in the process. And so we, as Deleuze and Guattari used to say, would make us a good sumo wrestler, right? If you combine the two features together or something. Yeah, maybe that
Yeah, I wondered if you could speak more about that question of audience and accessibility, because it is a book that's full of so many rich philosophical references and historical references, and yet is so timely, um, especially coming after the Black Lives Matter movement. So, how did you imagine the audience for the book, and how did that affect your translation choices?
I think, you know, it's a perhaps regrettable fact, but a fact nonetheless that American audiences don't read as much as the average French do. I think, at least the audience of this work, that at least as we envisioned it. And so we had in mind not my dissertation supervisors who were Foucault scholars, but the comrades that we had in struggle, and both of us have long histories of political activism. We wanted to write a book and to translate a book that is that would come across for them. And so the audience was above all people who are intelligent and committed and passionate, but might not have all of the philosophical references. They're there for the scholars, but the tone and the way we broke up sentences and the way we tried to convey the language was certainly with our friends in mind, political friends in mind. And so great care was taken to sort of try and unpack as much as we could the language, to put it on display as clearly as we could make it, in the sense of a vernacular. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the clarity of the translation was one of the things that made it stand out for the jury. Um, I also have a question, especially as someone who particularly works on race and translation, um, about how you managed translating Dorlin's work, which is so a lot of the movements that she's drawing on are based in the US. Um, but she has, in a sense, translated them into French. And so, how do you translate them back without assimilating them back into a US way of looking at questions of race and racism, which are usually so culturally based, but she has already kind of, taken a different angle on it. So how do you, have that balance of bringing it back into English without assimilating it into what we kind of already know?
Mm. I mean, I think you said it though, which is that Elsa's a distinct thinker in the French political tradition, in that she's extremely attentive to American race politics. She's very versed in not only the history of it, but also keeps abreast of the movements that were ongoing as she was writing it, and up until the point where she was publishing it, she was still reading and consuming, and even at the last minute stuff that's very close to the publication date finds its way into the book, and so there's I think in that sense, we were lucky to be able to not have to reach so far for the language, because in many ways she's citing, in many cases, English sources when it comes to the contemporary race stuff. But yeah, I think as far as the research into the more colonial histories, there we certainly had to track down a lot of source material to make sure that we were able to find the right terms. And there was a tremendous amount of historical work. For each chapter, I think we had no less than 20 or 30 source books that we had to track down and find. And so it was, that's just part of doing translating work that is genealogical in character. So I would just say, a big thank you to all the pirates of the world who've created these massive, dubiously legal archives that make source material a lot easier to find from your computer. You've done us all a great service, and we're all in your debt, whoever you are. I don't want to know.
And if Mrs. Pigeon would be surprised to see you here, did working on the Dorlin give you a translation bug, and do you have other projects lined up or dreamed of?
At the time, no, but I've been translating, I think, about 15 years now. I've translated a couple of books on Deleuze as well, and as well as others. So I guess you could say it's a longer term project for me, and I'm sure there'll be others in the future as well. And I know that Cedrine as well is currently translating, although I couldn't tell you exactly what the project is. You'd have to ask her.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for sharing Dorlan's work with us in English, and please
you.
another round of applause.
Thank you so much. Yeah.
I just want to quickly thank everyone for being here again. The prize has existed for over 35 years, and it remains a very valuable element of cultural exchange and intellectual exchange between France and the US, but it wouldn't be possible without you being here today with your support and your interest in this art. So thank you so much, especially to our board, Alan M. Chapin, our chairman, Ed Wallace, our vice chairman, and of course, Mr. Hurst, our host, as well as our jurors, Yasser El Hariri, Emmanuel Ertel, Tess Lewis, Corinne Tiktyrus, Lindsay Turner, and Allison Waters. And of course, our winning translators, Karen and Juliette, as well as the French American Foundation team. So thank you all very much.
Thank you.